In late 1942, the war in the Pacific had entered a transitional phase. Japanese forces had advanced across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific in 1941 to 1942, but the defeats at Coral Sea in May and Midway in June halted further expansion and cost the Imperial Navy several fleet carriers. The United States and its allies, meanwhile, were shifting from a purely defensive posture toward limited offensives designed to cut Japanese supply routes and protect communications with Australia. One of the earliest and most contested of these offensives unfolded in the Solomon Islands around the island of Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal's significance was primarily geographic and operational. A Japanese airfield under construction at Lunga Point threatened the sea lanes between the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. When U.S. Marines landed on August 7, 1942, and completed and renamed the airstrip Henderson Field, the island became a base from which land-based aircraft could interdict Japanese shipping, moving south from Rabaul and the Northern Solomons. Control of the waters around Guadalcanal, especially the approaches known collectively as Iron Bottom Sound, became essential for both sides' ability to reinforce and supply their ground forces. On land, the struggle evolved into a campaign of attrition. By November 1942, the Japanese 17th Army on Guadalcanal numbered several tens of thousands of personnel, but suffered from chronic shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies, with many soldiers weakened by malaria and malnutrition. U.S. forces, initially the 1st Marine Division and later reinforced by U.S. Army units, received more regular resupply, but still depended on vulnerable convoys that had to approach under threat from submarines, aircraft, and surface raiders. Both armies were constrained by jungle terrain, poor roads, and limited port facilities, which magnified the importance of sea control at night and air superiority by day. At sea, opposing naval doctrines and technologies shaped expectations. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested heavily in night fighting training and long-range torpedoes before the war. Destroyer and cruiser crews practiced coordinated attacks under low visibility and made extensive use of the Type 93 oxygen-fueled torpedo, which had a longer range and heavier warhead than most Allied torpedoes of the period. The U.S. Navy, by contrast, was rapidly introducing surface search radar, notably SG sets on some cruisers and destroyers, and expected that this equipment could provide an advantage in detection and fire control during night actions. Early Solomon's engagements, however, had already shown that technological advantages did not automatically translate into consistent tactical success. The months before Tassafaronga saw a sequence of naval battles in the same waters. The initial Japanese night victory off Savo Island in August 1942 inflicted heavy losses on Allied cruisers. Later actions at Cape Esperance in October and the two-phase naval battle of Guadalcanal in November cost both sides cruisers and destroyers. These engagements reduced the number of available heavy ships, strained crews, and generated differing interpretations in each navy. Japanese commanders saw evidence that well-handled destroyers could disrupt Allied surface formations, even when outnumbered. U.S. commanders concluded that radar-directed gunfire could, under some conditions, offset Japanese night fighting experience, but they also recognized that coordination between radar operators, flag staffs, and ship captains remained uneven. Logistics and geography drove Japanese choices in the weeks leading up to the Battle of Tassafaronga. Large, slow transports bound for Guadalcanal had repeatedly been attacked by Allied aircraft and surface forces. To continue supporting the 17th Army, the Japanese 8th Fleet based at Rabaul increasingly relied on fast destroyers to carry supplies down the slot, the channel between the Central Solomons Islands. This practice, known to Allied observers as the Tokyo Express, involved destroyers making high-speed nighttime runs from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal, unloading cargo in drums that could be floated ashore, and then withdrawing before daylight made them vulnerable to attack. From the Japanese perspective, these runs were a compromise between operational necessity and risk. Destroyers were designed as fleet escorts and attack ships rather than supply vessels, and diverting them to transport duty consumed fuel and reduced their availability for other missions. Yet the Army on Guadalcanal required thousands of tons of supplies per month to sustain operations. Commanders of Destroyer Squadron 2 and related formations had to balance instructions from Tokyo and Rabaul, maintain the garrison, and, if possible, prepare for renewed offensive action on the island, against the limits imposed by fuel stocks, crew fatigue, and increasing losses. On the Allied side, the South Pacific Area Command under Vice Admiral William F. Halsey sought to tighten the naval blockade of Guadalcanal as the campaign progressed. U.S. surface forces were organized into task forces and task groups composed of heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and destroyers, rotating between frontline duty and rear area refit. By late November, with the conclusion of the mid-November battles, there was an expectation within U.S. naval staffs that Japanese attempts to resupply by destroyer could be intercepted and defeated if radar-equipped cruisers and destroyers were positioned correctly, and if intelligence provided timely warning of departures from Japanese bases. Coast watchers and aerial reconnaissance played a significant role in shaping both planning and public narratives. Allied coast watchers on islands such as Bougainville reported Japanese ship movements southward, allowing U.S. commanders to estimate the scale and timing of Tokyo Express missions. Japanese search aircraft, operating from bases in the northern Solomons and Bismarck Archipelago, likewise tracked Allied convoys near Guadalcanal and occasionally sighted surface groups maneuvering in Iron Bottom Sound. These intelligence flows informed operational orders, but did not always capture the opposing side's exact strength or intentions, contributing to miscalculations on the eve of the engagement off Tassafaronga. Within Japan and the United States, public awareness of the Guadalcanal fighting in November 1942 reflected broader war aims rather than the details of individual battles. Japanese media emphasized determination to hold the southern defensive perimeter, while official communiques often underreported difficulties on Guadalcanal. In the United States, news of earlier naval and ground actions, including substantial ship losses in the Solomons, was balanced by the assertion that holding Henderson Field was essential to keeping pressure on Japan. Against this backdrop, the decision of Japanese naval leaders to mount another destroyer supply run to Tassafaronga, and of U.S. commanders to commit a cruiser-destroyer force to intercept it, emerged from converging strategic priorities: sustain or isolate the Guadalcanal garrison, preserve key naval assets, and influence the wider course of the campaign in the South Pacific. On the 30th of November, 1942, the opposing naval forces moved toward contact under conditions that both sides believed they understood, but neither fully controlled. At Rabaul and the Shortland Islands, Japanese staff officers finalized another supply run to Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, commanding Destroyer Squadron 2, received orders to deliver several hundred tons of supplies in drums to the Tassafaronga area on the northwest coast of the island. His force consisted of the light cruiser Sendai as flagship, the destroyer Shikinami as an escort and screening vessel, and 6 destroyers: Naganami, Kuroshio, Oyashio, Kagero, Takanami, and Makinami, configured to carry cargo on deck and in place of some torpedo reloads. The plan called for a night approach from the northwest along the familiar route down the Slot. The destroyers assigned to transport duty carried fuel drums, ammunition, and rations intended for the 17th Army. On reaching the unloading area off Tassafaronga, they were to jettison the drums, which shore parties would later retrieve, and then withdraw before daylight. Sendai and 1 destroyer would act primarily as cover and as a command platform, with the others balancing their dual roles as supply carriers and torpedo platforms. Japanese expectations were shaped by prior runs. Allied attempts to intercept had sometimes caused damage and losses, but many expeditions had successfully arrived and withdrawn in darkness. On the Allied side, intelligence signals indicated that another Tokyo Express mission was imminent. Coastwatcher reports and aerial reconnaissance suggested movements from the northern bases, consistent with a destroyer formation heading toward Guadalcanal. In response, the U.S. Navy organized Task Force 67 under Rear Admiral Carlton H. Wright. Its surface striking group included 4 heavy cruisers: Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, and Northampton, 1 light cruiser, Honolulu, and 4 destroyers: Fletcher, Drayton, Maury, and Perkins. Most of these cruisers carried 8-inch main batteries and were equipped with surface search radar, which U.S. planners regarded as a key advantage in night engagements. Command arrangements reflected lessons and unresolved issues from earlier battles. Wright flew his flag in Minneapolis and exercised overall control of the formation. A separate destroyer screen, led tactically by Commander William Cole in Fletcher, was responsible for initial contact and, if ordered, a torpedo attack. The U.S. force was organized in line ahead. Destroyers in the van, followed by the cruisers. Staff officers intended that radar information from the leading ships and from cruiser plotting rooms would guide the timing of gunfire and torpedo launches, enabling an ambush against any Japanese column moving along the expected track toward Tassafaronga. Shortly after nightfall, both forces were operating in waters that had already acquired a reputation for sudden encounters. Visibility on 30 November was limited by darkness, but not by heavy weather. The sea state allowed high speeds. Japanese lookouts scanned the horizon using optical equipment and relied on their experience with silhouettes and engine noises. They did not have shipborne radar comparable to U.S. sets and thus depended on visual observation and prearranged track planning. The American ships, by contrast, depended heavily on their S, G, and older SC radar sets, with operators reporting contacts to the bridges and flag plots, where officers had to interpret bearings and ranges in real time. As the Japanese column approached from the northwest at around 20 to 30 knots, Tanaka and his captains followed a timetable that aimed to place the transports off Tassafaronga around midnight. Each destroyer's deck was crowded with supply drums, which complicated damage control and limited arcs for some weapons. Torpedo crews remained at their stations in case of an unexpected encounter. The Japanese command expectation was that, if they met Allied surface forces, the destroyers would rely on their torpedoes and maneuverability to break contact, protecting the supply mission, or, if necessary, abandoning it to preserve the ships. Wright's task force moved westward and then northward from the waters east of Guadalcanal, aiming to cross the projected Japanese track at a right angle. The U.S. ships maintained radio silence except for essential tactical signals and navigational reports. In plotting rooms, officers tracked radar returns that appeared and disappeared against the background of islands and land clutter. The intention was to detect the Japanese formation at sufficient range to allow the destroyers to launch a torpedo attack, followed by concentrated cruiser gunfire before the enemy could respond effectively. The disparity between what each side believed it knew and what was actually occurring began to develop in these early hours. Japanese planners assumed that destroyer runs, though risky, could still exploit gaps in Allied detection. American officers, reviewing recent engagements, believed that radar-directed fire and coordination would provide an opportunity to inflict heavy damage on any formation that attempted to approach Tassafaronga. The immediate opening phase of the battle thus emerged not from a sudden decision on the spot, but from a convergence of operational patterns. The continuation of Tokyo Express supply missions, and the growing Allied practice of using radar-equipped cruiser-destroyer groups to intercept them in the confined waters off Guadalcanal. Strategic considerations for the night of 30 November were shaped by months of cumulative decisions. For the Japanese High Command, Guadalcanal was one part of a wider defensive system, stretching from the Aleutians through the Central Pacific to New Guinea. By late November, operations elsewhere demanded carriers, battleships, and air units, limiting what could be allocated to the Solomons. As a result, the 8th Fleet at Rabaul received instructions to sustain the 17th Army, primarily with destroyer-borne supply missions, relying on speed and night tactics rather than large, heavily escorted convoys. Within this framework, the specific mission to Tassafaronga had clear objectives. Tanaka was ordered to land several hundred tons of food, ammunition, and fuel in drums off a section of coast judged suitable for later recovery by small craft and shore parties. The choice of Tassafaronga reflected both geography and experience. It lay west of Lunga Point, away from the heaviest concentration of Allied forces, and previous runs had shown that dispersed unloading areas reduced the predictability of supply points. The primary measure of success for the operation was the volume of supplies delivered, not engagement with enemy forces. Japanese planners accepted that their destroyers had to operate in dual roles. Each ship carried both supply drums and a standard complement of torpedoes. The doctrine anticipated that if an Allied surface force appeared, the destroyers would deliver a concentrated torpedo salvo to disrupt or deter the enemy, then break contact. Training emphasized coordinated salvo firing at relatively long ranges in darkness, using pre-war and early war experience with night combat. Confidence in the type. 93 torpedoes' range and explosive power contributed to a belief that a smaller Japanese force, if handled correctly, could repel or damage a numerically superior opponent. Constraints were significant. Fuel stocks at Rabaul and the Shortlands were under pressure from continuous operations. Maintenance demands accumulated on hulls and machinery that had operated at high speed for extended periods. Crews had undergone repeated night missions, which affected alertness and efficiency. Yet the requirement to keep the Guadalcanal garrison supplied overrode these concerns. From the Japanese perspective, failing to maintain the flow of supplies risked the gradual weakening of the 17th Army, potentially forcing evacuation, or a costly attempt to retake lost ground. On the Allied side, South Pacific Area Headquarters viewed each Tokyo Express mission as both a threat and an opportunity. Intercepting destroyer runs promised to reduce the supplies reaching Japanese ground forces and, at the same time, inflict losses on skilled enemy crews and modern ships. For Halsey's command, which reported to the Pacific Fleet under Admiral Chester Nimitz, success in such interceptions would reinforce the broader strategy of attrition against Japanese naval power while supporting the ground campaign on Guadalcanal. Task Force 67 was organized with these goals in mind. The plan called for radar-equipped cruisers and destroyers to establish a blocking position between Guadalcanal and the expected approach route from the northwest. Detailed orders specified a night interception, beginning with a destroyer torpedo attack, when radar indicated that the Japanese column was within range, followed by heavy cruiser gunfire to complete the destruction or disablement of enemy ships. American doctrine, influenced by recent experience at Cape Esperance and the naval battle of Guadalcanal, stressed concentrated fire against the enemy van to disrupt command and fire control. However, several assumptions shaped planning in ways that would prove significant. U.S. staff officers believed that their Mark 15 torpedoes, fired from destroyers at moderate ranges, would function reliably against enemy ships. In practice, these weapons suffered from depth-keeping and detonator problems that were not yet fully understood. Likewise, confidence in radar tended to mask the complexities of translating electronic contacts into accurate firing solutions and coordinated movements in a multi-ship formation under combat conditions. Both sides faced command and control challenges. Japanese ships would rely on flag signals, prearranged maneuver plans, and voice communications over short distances, all under a mission control to reduce the risk of detection. American ships, though equipped with more advanced electronics, had to manage a high volume of information from radar, lookouts, and plotting teams, while maintaining formation discipline in darkness. The ability of individual captains and staff officers to interpret partial data quickly would play a decisive role once contact occurred. Weather, time, and air power framed the boundaries of what planners expected. Neither side intended to fight under daylight conditions near Guadalcanal, where aircraft from Henderson Field could intervene. Japanese schedules aimed to complete unloading and withdrawal before sunrise. American plans assumed that any engagement would occur at night, but within a time window that allowed damaged ships to retire towards safer waters before daylight. Within these constraints, the Battle of Tassafaronga was prepared as another in a series of calculated risks, a Japanese effort to sustain a beleaguered garrison, and an American attempt to exploit new technologies and tactics to tighten control of a contested sea. Shortly before 2300 hours, radar operators on the leading U.S. destroyers began to pick up contacts to the northwest. Bearings and ranges stabilized into a pattern that suggested a column of ships approaching along the anticipated route. Reports flowed to the flag plot in Minneapolis, where Rear Admiral Wright and his staff evaluated the data against expectations for a destroyer supply force. The contacts appeared at roughly the correct distance and course for a Tokyo Express mission, confirming that the interception was developing as planned. the U.S. formation adjusted course to place itself across the Japanese track. Destroyers in the van received orders to prepare for torpedo firing. In plotting rooms and on bridges, officers calculated estimated enemy speed and bearing changes to produce firing solutions. At the same time, cruisers readied their main batteries with star shell and high explosive rounds, intending to open fire once torpedoes were away, or if radar showed that the range was closing rapidly. The overall concept remained an ambush: detect first, fire first, and use concentrated gunfire to prevent an effective Japanese counterattack. In the Japanese column, lookouts on Takanami, positioned near the van, scanned the darkness for silhouettes and gun flashes. Tanaka's destroyers maintained their planned high speed, with Sendai and Shikanami in covering positions and the supply-laden ships following. At this stage, Japanese commanders believed they remained undetected and on schedule for the unloading off Tassafaronga. Torpedo crews stood ready, but attention was still divided between navigation, timing for the jettisoning of drums, and standard watch routines. The moment of initial contact was shaped by differing sensor reliance. U.S. destroyer radars showed multiple returns at ranges under 10,000 yards, but there was debate within the formation over the exact composition of the enemy force. Some officers believed they were facing only destroyers, while others considered the possibility of a light cruiser present as a flagship. These assessments influenced both torpedo firing plans and the selection of initial gun targets. Communications between the destroyer screen and the cruisers, carried by voice radio and maneuvering signals, had to reconcile these differing interpretations in a short time. Wright authorized the destroyers to launch torpedoes based on radar-derived positions. Salvos left the American tubes toward the estimated location of the Japanese column. Because the torpedoes ran unseen beneath the surface and no immediate explosions followed, crews on U.S. ships had no confirmation of effect. The destroyers then began to turn aside in accordance with their orders, clearing arcs for the cruisers and adjusting their own positions to avoid interfering with the planned gunfire engagement. Japanese lookouts first detected the presence of U.S. forces not through devices but visually. Observers reported shapes and, soon after, the first flashes of gunfire as American cruisers opened fire, guided by radar ranges and bearings. Shells from 8-inch and 6-inch guns began to fall around the leading Japanese destroyer, Takanami. Within moments, Takanami was hit by multiple shells. Fires broke out on board, and her ability to maneuver and respond was severely reduced. From the American perspective, this appeared to confirm the effectiveness of the radar-guided opening. Under fire, Japanese commanders reacted quickly. Despite the intense shelling of Takanami, other destroyers in the column began to execute torpedo attack maneuvers. Using their own estimates of enemy bearing and speed drawn from visual observation and prior plotting, they prepared to launch spreads of Type 93 torpedoes toward the flashes of U.S. gunfire. Decks loaded with supply drums limited arcs and complicated handling, but crews worked to clear sectors and set correct firing angles. As the first minutes of engagement unfolded, the geometry of the battle shifted. U.S. cruisers, believing they had achieved tactical surprise, continued to concentrate fire on the van, with Takanami as the most visible target. Destroyers that had already launched torpedoes maneuvered according to prearranged patterns, but the exact positions of Japanese ships were increasingly difficult to track amid splashes, smoke, and changing courses. On the Japanese side, individual captains exercised initiative within the general order to deliver torpedo attacks and evade gunfire. The first Japanese torpedo salvos left their tubes in these initial minutes, unseen and unreported, beginning their long underwater runs toward the American line as both sides focused on the visible exchange of gunfire. The first Japanese torpedo hits reached the American line within minutes of the opening gunfire. Minneapolis, in the lead among the heavy cruisers, was struck by 2 Type 93 torpedoes on her port bow. One warhead detonated forward near the turrets, the other under the bridge area. The explosions destroyed a large section of the bow, caused severe flooding, and temporarily disabled steering and power systems. The ship lost headway and swung out of formation, trailing oil and debris. Damage control teams moved to isolate flooded compartments and prevent progressive loss of buoyancy. Close behind, New Orleans encountered similar effects from another torpedo. A hit forward on the port side detonated near her magazines, severing the bow almost back to the forward turret. The entire forward section folded away and sank, taking with it one of the main battery turrets, anchor gear, and crew stationed in those areas. The ship's speed dropped sharply. Despite this, machinery spaces aft remained intact, allowing her to continue moving slowly under her own power, while crews worked to shore bulkheads and extinguish fires. Pensacola, following the first two cruisers, maneuvered to avoid the damaged ships and maintain distance from perceived torpedo tracks. In doing so, she presented a more vulnerable angle to subsequent torpedoes. A Type 93 struck her port side beneath the mainmast, rupturing fuel tanks and starting extensive fires as oil spread across the water and on deck. Flames rose around the after 8-inch turrets and anti-aircraft mounts. Firefighting parties attempted to contain the blaze while also managing the risk of ammunition, explosions, and nearby magazines. Northampton, positioned toward the rear of the cruiser column, initially escaped damage and maneuvered to cover the crippled ships. However, as she turned, two torpedoes struck her port side in quick succession. The explosions opened large holes below the waterline, causing rapid flooding and a pronounced list. Pumps and counter-flooding slowed, but did not halt the ingress of water. Within a relatively short period, it became clear to her officers that the ship could not remain afloat indefinitely. The light cruiser Honolulu and the 4 U.S. destroyers escaped direct torpedo damage during this phase, but their tactical situation became more complex. The formation was no longer a coherent line. Instead, it had become a group of damaged and maneuvering ships, some slowed, others attempting to avoid collision and further torpedo threats. Communications between ships were affected by battle damage and the need to focus on immediate survival tasks. Radar plots that had been central to the initial ambush now competed with reports of fires, flooding, and casualties. On the Japanese side, the situation was equally dynamic but of a different character. Takanami, hammered by cruiser gunfire, was burning and effectively out of the fight. Later, she would sink with heavy loss of life. Other destroyers, however, had already completed their torpedo launches and were now turning away at high speed, laying smoke and altering courses to confuse American fire control. Some captains, confronted with the intensity of the U.S. gunfire and the damage to their consort, abandoned attempts to unload supplies and focused exclusively on disengagement. Casualties mounted on both sides. On the American cruisers, torpedo hits in crewed compartments caused immediate fatalities and injuries from blast, fragmentation, and drowning in rapidly flooding spaces. Estimates for U.S. losses that night run into the hundreds killed and wounded across the 4 damaged heavy cruisers. Japanese losses were concentrated on Takanami, where a significant proportion of the crew perished either during the shelling or when the ship later sank. Survivors from Takanami entered the water in darkness, some later reaching shore or being recovered, others lost. Terrain and environmental factors contributed to the crisis. The confined waters near Guadalcanal limited options for evasive maneuvers at high speed, especially for damaged ships. The presence of nearby landmasses created radar clutter and complicated navigation. Smoke from fires, gun blasts, and smoke screens reduced already limited visibility. In these conditions, commanders on both sides had to make rapid decisions with incomplete information about the positions and states of friendly and enemy units. As the engagement continued, the initial American expectation of a one-sided interception gave way to the reality of a costly exchange. Radar had allowed Task Force 67 to fire first and disable the Japanese van destroyer. Japanese night fighting doctrine and torpedo technology, however, had converted a brief window of opportunity into a series of damaging hits against the larger cruisers. The battle had escalated from an intended ambush into a crisis of survival and withdrawal, with each navy reassessing whether its immediate objectives, supply delivery for the Japanese, interdiction, and ship preservation for the Americans, could still be met under the evolving circumstances. In the minutes after the torpedoes struck, the engagement reached its most intense phase. On board Minneapolis and New Orleans, damage control parties advanced into compartments that were flooding or filled with smoke. Bulkhead doors were dogged shut to contain water, and counter-flooding orders were issued to reduce lists. Electrical crews worked to restore partial power to steering and pumps. The loss of entire bow sections altered trim and reduced speed, but both cruisers remained afloat and retained some fighting capability, including aft main battery turrets and anti-aircraft guns. Pensacola's situation was dominated by fire rather than structural loss forward. Burning fuel from ruptured tanks spread along the port side and around the after superstructure. Firefighting teams deployed hoses and foam, but the heat near ammunition handling areas forced temporary withdrawal from some stations. Commanders faced a balance between continuing to engage with remaining guns and dedicating more crew to containing the fire. As the blaze progressed, the risk of secondary explosions and further casualties increased, making fire control a central focus of the ship's survival. For Northampton, the priority became stabilization, long enough to allow evacuation if necessary. After the torpedo hits opened large breaches below the waterline, pumps and damage control measures slowed, but could not stop the rising water. The list to port increased, and trim by the stern worsened. Orders were given to lighten the ship by jettisoning topside weight. Despite these efforts, repeated assessments indicated that hull integrity could not be preserved. Northampton continued to make way for a time, providing a moving target and space for other ships, but the cumulative flooding set limits on how long she could remain afloat. The U.S. destroyers in Honolulu attempted to impose some order on the battlefield. Destroyers maneuvered to lay smoke between the damaged cruisers and the estimated positions of Japanese ships, while also searching for torpedo tracks and potential new contacts. Honolulu, less damaged and more maneuverable, adjusted her course to avoid the crippled cruisers and continued to fire intermittently at radar or visual targets when available. However, the combination of smoke, fires, splashes, and the changing positions of friendly vessels reduced opportunities for concentrated, well-directed gunfire. On the Japanese side, the peak of the action was experienced as a sequence of rapid maneuvers under heavy fire. Destroyers that had launched torpedoes turned sharply away, some to port and others to starboard, in accordance with pre-planned evasion patterns. Smoke generators were activated to obscure silhouettes from American guns. Sendai and Shikanami maintained covering positions, but did not close to engage in a prolonged gun duel, in part because the original mission emphasized supply delivery and withdrawal rather than a decisive surface action with heavier enemy cruisers. Within individual Japanese ships, reports from lookouts and gunnery officers suggested that several large enemy vessels had been hit and were burning. The scale of observed fires on American cruisers led some officers to estimate that multiple ships might be lost. At the same time, the condition of Takanami was evident. She remained under concentrated fire, and attempts to assist her directly would have required closing into zones already registered by U.S. gunnery. The decision to prioritize maneuver and withdrawal for the rest of the column meant accepting the probable loss of one destroyer to preserve others. Tactical communication during these minutes reflected the strain on both command systems. In the American force, damage to antennas and power supplies interfered with radio transmissions from some cruisers. Voice radio was heavily occupied with urgent reports about fires, flooding, and steering problems. Signals concerning coordinated gunfire and further torpedo attacks became less frequent as each ship concentrated on its immediate situation. Japanese ships, operating under prearranged signal plans, used limited radio and light signals to indicate course changes and withdrawal intentions while maintaining general emission control. The original Japanese plan to unload supplies at Tassafaronga was effectively abandoned during this peak period. Decks crowded with drums, combined with the need for high-speed evasion, made jettison operations impractical. Commanders weighed the risk of slowing to offload against the probability of renewed engagement if they remained near Guadalcanal until daylight. Preserving destroyers and experienced crews for future operations took precedence, even though this meant that the 17th Army on the island would not receive the planned tonnage of supplies from this mission. For Task Force 67, the battle's most intense moments forced an early reconsideration of objectives. The heavy damage to 3 cruisers and the critical condition of Northampton raised questions about continuing offensive action. While some guns were still capable of firing and one Japanese destroyer had been severely damaged and later lost, the presence of additional torpedoes in the water and the risk of further hits weighed heavily on Wright and his subordinates. The peak of the battle thus became a transition point, from an attempted interception focused on destruction of the enemy column to an emerging emphasis on preserving damaged ships and withdrawing them from immediate danger. As the immediate exchange of torpedoes and gunfire subsided, both sides shifted from attack to survival and adaptation. On the American cruisers, resistance took the form of systematic damage control. Aboard Minneapolis and New Orleans, teams reinforced bulkheads with shoring timbers, rigged portable pumps, and ran emergency power cables to restore lighting in vital compartments. Medical staff set up improvised treatment areas close to the main deck to handle burns, shrapnel wounds, and injuries from collapsing structures. Officers reassessed stability calculations repeatedly, adjusting counter-flooding as the ship settled bow down but remained afloat. Pensacola's crew concentrated on confining fires that threatened magazines and engineering spaces. Fire parties advanced in stages, cooling bulkheads with water to prevent heat transfer and rotating personnel to reduce exhaustion. Ammunition was shifted or jettisoned from exposed positions to lower the risk of detonation. The ability to maintain even limited propulsion allowed Pensacola to steer away from the most confined waters, giving damage control teams more time and space to work. Their efforts reduced the intensity of flames around critical structures, buying hours that would prove decisive in keeping the ship afloat. On Northampton, adaptation meant preparing for the possibility that resistance would not be enough to save the hull. As the list increased and trim by the stern worsened, the captain ordered non-essential personnel topside and began organizing boat and raft deployment. Radio operators transmitted status reports and, eventually, distress calls to nearby ships. Even as gun crews remained at their stations for a time, others rigged lines and Jacob's ladders, anticipating an order to abandon ship. The crew reorganized into evacuation groups, with officers and petty officers assigned to control movement and reduce the risk of panic during the final stages. U.S. destroyers adjusted their role from offensive screen to rescue and protective escort. Fletcher, Drayton, Maury, and Perkins maneuvered close to the damaged cruisers, illuminating sections of the sea with searchlights when safe to do so, and launching boats to recover personnel who had gone overboard. At the same time, they laid smoke to reduce the visibility of burning ships from any remaining Japanese units and maintained sonar watch in case submarines attempted to exploit the situation. Their torpedo batteries remained loaded, but the immediate priority had shifted to shielding cripples and gathering survivors. Japanese destroyers, having launched their torpedoes and evaded initial counterfire, adapted by dispersing and increasing speed. Captains altered courses independently within the framework of general withdrawal, using smoke and the backdrop of the coastline to break visual contact. Gunnery officers fired limited salvos when they believed they had a clear target, but the emphasis was no longer on sustained engagement. Instead, resistance to American pursuit took the form of maneuver, speed changes, and adherence to pre-planned evasion patterns that reduced predictability. Within the Japanese command structure, the outcome of the encounter was interpreted through the dual lenses of loss and effectiveness. The probable loss of Takanami represented a reduction in the available destroyer force, which was already stretched by frequent Tokyo Express missions. At the same time, the observed condition of multiple American cruisers suggested that the torpedo doctrine and training remained effective even under conditions of surprise and intense incoming fire. These contrasting impressions would inform later tactical guidance: maintain aggressive torpedo tactics, but avoid prolonged exchanges against radar-equipped ships. On Guadalcanal itself, both ground forces felt the indirect consequences. For the Japanese 17th Army, reports that the supply run had been disrupted and that no substantial tonnage had been landed meant that rationing and improvisation would continue. Units already operating with limited food stocks and ammunition had to revise expectations for future operations. Staff officers considered further reductions in offensive plans and additional reliance on small craft and overland transport to distribute whatever supplies could be brought in by later efforts. American ground forces received information in the opposite direction. The Navy had engaged another Tokyo Express run and reported Japanese losses, but also acknowledged serious damage to several heavy cruisers. For officers on Guadalcanal, this reinforced an understanding that control of the surrounding seas was not absolute, and that naval support, while significant, came at a cost in ships and personnel. The need to maintain Henderson Field as a base for air support remained central, and the Army and Marine units continued to organize ground defenses under the assumption that Japanese efforts to reinforce or evacuate their forces would persist. Psychologically, crews and commanders on both sides processed the battle as a test of their respective systems. U.S. personnel experienced the advantages of radar detection and initial gunfire, offset by unexpected torpedo effectiveness, and the complexities of coordinating large formations at night. Japanese sailors and officers saw that their destroyers could still deliver damaging attacks, despite being surprised and outgunned, but also recognized the vulnerability of individual ships like Takanami under concentrated radar-directed fire. These impressions influenced training, tactical discussions, and expectations for future engagements in the Solomon Islands. In the wider South Pacific command structures, adaptation took the form of review and analysis. American staff officers began compiling reports on radar performance, torpedo reliability, formation tactics, and damage patterns, identifying areas where doctrine and equipment might require modification. Japanese planners at Rabaul evaluated fuel consumption, destroyer wear, and the effectiveness of supply delivery versus losses incurred, considering whether continued large-scale runs to Guadalcanal could be justified under prevailing conditions. In this way, the resistance shown during the battle evolved into institutional learning processes on both sides, even before the final outcome and longer-term decisions became clear. The turning point emerging from the Battle of Tassafaronga did not occur in a single order or explosion, but in the accumulation of outcomes that confronted both commands by morning. In purely material terms, the night action had produced sharply asymmetric ship losses. On the American side, the heavy cruiser Northampton sank after torpedo damage and progressive flooding, with hundreds of crew entering the water before rescue by destroyers. 3 other heavy cruisers, Minneapolis, New Orleans, and Pensacola, sustained torpedo hits that removed or crippled their bows and caused significant fires and flooding. U.S. casualties across these 4 ships numbered in the range of several hundred killed and wounded. By contrast, Japanese surface losses consisted primarily of 1 destroyer, Takanami, with roughly 200 crew killed or missing, while other destroyers escaped with minor or no damage. However, these immediate figures did not reflect the underlying operational goal of the Japanese mission. The original task had been to deliver several hundred tons of supplies, food, ammunition, fuel, to the 17th Army on Guadalcanal. Under the pressure of the engagement, this objective was largely unfulfilled. Most of the destroyers carrying drums either jettisoned them prematurely or retained them while maneuvering at high speed, and then withdrew without conducting organized unloading off the Tassafaronga coast. As a result, the Japanese force left the area with its destroyer strength mostly intact, but without having achieved the primary logistical purpose of the operation. For Japanese high command, this combination of ship survival and supply failure marked a turning point in how the Guadalcanal campaign was assessed. Reports from Tanaka and other officers indicated that, although Type 93 torpedoes and night maneuvers had proven effective in damaging multiple American cruisers, the pattern of recent months showed a growing mismatch between what destroyer supply runs could deliver and the garrison's needs. Estimates of daily calorie requirements and ammunition expenditure for the 17th Army, compared with the average tonnage landed by the Tokyo Express under increasing Allied pressure, indicated that shortages would persist even if similar missions continued. In Tokyo, and at the Combined Fleet headquarters, staff officers integrated the Tassafaronga outcome into broader calculations. The Imperial Navy had lost several cruisers and destroyers in earlier Solomon's battles and now had to consider whether repeated night actions near Guadalcanal were an efficient use of remaining surface forces. Air units were required in other theaters, fuel stocks were finite, and the prospect of further attrition against radar-equipped U.S. groups was significant. Although the battle had demonstrated that destroyers could inflict serious damage even when surprised, it also underscored that such engagements did not necessarily translate into sustainable support for the island's defenders. On the American side, the same engagement produced a different type of turning point. Tactically, Task Force 67 suffered what contemporary observers described as a defeat. 1 heavy cruiser lost, 3 heavily damaged, and no confirmed sinkings beyond a single Japanese destroyer. Yet the wider strategic context was that U.S. forces still held Henderson Field, maintained a functioning supply line to Guadalcanal, and retained a numerically larger and more replaceable cruiser force in the Pacific. The damage at Tassafaronga required months of repair time in rear area shipyards, temporarily reducing available heavy surface units in the South Pacific, but did not alter the overall trajectory of American industrial and naval expansion. Within South Pacific Area headquarters, the turning point took the form of increased attention to night fighting doctrine, torpedo performance, and formation tactics. Analysis of the battle revealed that U.S. Mark 15 torpedoes had not achieved documented hits despite radar-guided firing, while Japanese torpedoes had been both reliable and destructive. This led to a gradual reassessment of torpedo design, depth settings, and detonator mechanisms in subsequent months. Similarly, staff studies highlighted the difficulty of coordinating radar information between multiple ships in a line-ahead formation and the risk of presenting a concentrated target for long-range torpedo salvos. For the ground forces on Guadalcanal, the turning point was visible in supply patterns rather than ship silhouettes. The failure of the Tassafaronga run to deliver substantial cargo, combined with earlier unsuccessful attempts, contributed to worsening conditions for the 17th Army. Medical and quartermaster officers reported increasing rates of disease and malnutrition, with many units operating on reduced rations. American forces, while not free from logistical constraints, were receiving ammunition, food, and reinforcements in quantities that contrasted with the Japanese situation. The cumulative effect was a widening gap in operational endurance on the island. In Japanese planning circles, the conclusion that emerged over the following weeks was that continued attempts to reinforce Guadalcanal at previous scales would impose high risks on the fleet without realistically restoring the balance ashore. The experience at Tassafaronga, where a tactically successful torpedo action had not yielded the intended logistical result, supported arguments for reconsidering the entire commitment to the island. Discussions began to shift from how to reinforce and resume offensive operations to whether evacuation and a reorientation of the defensive perimeter might be necessary. Thus, the Battle of Tassafaronga acted as a pivot in 2 overlapping ways. For Japan, it underlined the limits of destroyer-based logistics against an opponent with growing air and surface strength, helping to tip deliberations toward eventual withdrawal from Guadalcanal. For the United States, it exposed weaknesses in night surface tactics and torpedo technology even in the midst of a broader strategic advance, prompting doctrinal and technical changes. The turning point was therefore not a dramatic reversal on the water in a single hour, but a redefinition of what each side considered achievable in the Guadalcanal campaign. By the early hours of December 1st, the shooting had stopped, but the consequences of the encounter were still unfolding on the dark sea. Northampton, which had continued to settle by the stern, despite counter-flooding and jettisoning, reached the limit of her buoyancy. With fires spreading and the list increasing, the order to abandon ship was given. Lifeboats, rafts, and floater nets went into the water, and organized groups of crew left the cruiser in stages. Destroyers Fletcher and Drayton closed as far as they could, recovering men from the sea over several hours. Out of a complement of roughly 1,200, about 773 survivors were picked up. Around 50 were killed in the torpedo explosions and subsequent flooding. Northampton finally sank after 3 a.m., a few nautical miles off Guadalcanal. Minneapolis, New Orleans, and Pensacola, all heavily damaged but still afloat, made for Tulagi at low speed under their own power, or with assistance. Their reduced bows and flooded forward compartments limited speed to under 10 knots. By morning, they reached Anchorage, where emergency repairs began. Pensacola's fuel fires continued to burn for many hours before being brought under control. Temporary patches and internal shoring made the hulls watertight enough for onward movement. In subsequent days, Minneapolis and New Orleans received improvised wooden bows built from timber, allowing them to steam to major repair facilities at Espiritu Santo and Sydney. Pensacola proceeded for more extensive work in the rear areas. All three cruisers were out of frontline service for many months, returning to action only in the second half of 1943. American casualty reports compiled after the battle recorded between 395 and 417 personnel killed across the four cruisers, including 183 on New Orleans, 125 on Pensacola, 37 on Minneapolis, and around 50 on Northampton, with additional wounded distributed across the damaged ships. On the Japanese side, the loss of Takanami cost approximately 197 to 211 dead, with only a few dozen survivors reaching shore, and a smaller number eventually taken prisoner. These figures illustrate the asymmetry of losses in ships and personnel. One destroyer lost versus one heavy cruiser sunk, and 3 heavily damaged, even though the Japanese formation had been outgunned in terms of total main battery calibers. Tanaka's remaining destroyers regrouped as they cleared Iron Bottom Sound and retired toward the Shortland Islands. The return passage took around 10 hours. En route, some ships attempted limited rescue of Takanami survivors when it was tactically feasible, but the risk of renewed contact with U.S. forces restricted these efforts. On arrival, reports to 8th Fleet Headquarters emphasized both the failure to unload supplies and the extent of damage inflicted on the American cruisers. From the Japanese operational perspective, the engagement had demonstrated that torpedo tactics remained effective, but also that destroyer-based supply missions were increasingly difficult to complete in the face of Allied interception. In the immediate aftermath, both navies undertook internal reviews. Within the U.S. South Pacific Command, after-action reports discussed radar performance, the timing and range of destroyer torpedo launches, and the vulnerability of cruiser lines to long-range Type 93 torpedoes. Formal inquiries noted that 44 Japanese torpedoes had been launched during the action, several of which struck despite the American force having fired first. Command decisions and formation handling at night were scrutinized, but no single procedural failure was identified as the sole cause of the losses. Instead, the analysis pointed to a combination of factors: the delay in authorizing U.S. torpedo fire, the predictability of the cruiser line's course and speed, and incomplete understanding of Japanese torpedo range and performance. Japanese headquarters likewise assessed the battle in relation to the broader Guadalcanal resupply problem. Calculations of drum delivery rates versus losses in ships and fuel showed that even successful runs delivered only a fraction of the garrison's monthly requirements. Tassafaronga, where torpedoes had disabled or sunk multiple enemy cruisers, yet the cargo had not been landed, became a key data point in arguments that the current method of sustaining the 17th Army was no longer viable. Subsequent attempts, such as a large destroyer run on the 11th of December, that resulted in the loss of Teruzuki and only partial recovery of drums, reinforced this conclusion. On Guadalcanal, the immediate consequences were felt unevenly. Japanese units received confirmation that no major resupply had arrived and ration scales remained low. Medical reports recorded continuing high rates of malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition. American forces, in contrast, maintained their existing pattern of convoy-based logistics, protected by surface forces and aircraft from Henderson Field. They were aware that another night battle had cost the fleet heavily in cruisers, but for the ground units, the practical outcome was that Japanese offensive capacity on the island continued to decline rather than recover. By mid-December 1942, the cumulative effect of such operations led the Imperial Navy to recommend abandoning Guadalcanal. After internal debate with the Army and deliberation at Imperial General Headquarters, the decision was taken on December 31st to withdraw the remaining Japanese forces and establish a new defensive line farther northwest in the Central Solomons. Planning began for the evacuation operation, later designated K, which would use many of the same destroyers that had previously run supplies, but now to remove troops rather than deliver cargo. In this sense, The withdrawal phase after Tassafaronga included not only the recovery of damaged ships and survivors, but also a strategic retreat from the attempt to sustain a major garrison on Guadalcanal by sea. In the longer perspective of the Pacific War, the Battle of Tassafaronga occupied a complex place in both navies' histories. Contemporary American accounts often recorded it as one of several costly night engagements in Iron Bottom Sound, a battle in which radar-equipped cruisers suffered heavy damage despite firing first. Japanese narratives, by contrast, highlighted the effectiveness of destroyer torpedo tactics and the ability of a smaller surface force to inflict disproportionate damage, even when operating under the constraints of a supply mission. Over time, historians would treat the battle as an instructive case study in the interaction between technology, doctrine, and logistics. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, Tassafaronga reinforced existing confidence in night fighting proficiency and in the Type 93 torpedo. The engagement showed that well-trained destroyer crews could still achieve results against larger formations. However, when assessed together with the failure to land supplies and the later decision to evacuate Guadalcanal, the battle also demonstrated that tactical success at sea did not necessarily translate into sustainable operational advantage. The eventual withdrawal of the 17th Army and the shift of the defensive line northward reduced the strategic value of victories that produced ship damage but did not alter control of the island or the surrounding airspace. The United States Navy absorbed different lessons. Losses and damage at Tassafaronga accelerated efforts to improve torpedo reliability, radar integration, and night doctrine. Investigations into the performance of Mark 15 torpedoes contributed to later changes in depth settings and exploder design. Tactical reviews examined formation dispositions, the timing of destroyer attacks, and communication between radar operators, captains, and flag officers. In subsequent campaigns in the Central and Western Pacific, U.S. surface forces increasingly combined radar-directed gunfire, improved torpedo practice, and more flexible formations, reducing the likelihood of repeating the pattern seen off Tassafaronga. From a broader strategic perspective, the battle formed part of the sequence of events that culminated in Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal. The inability to deliver sufficient supplies by destroyer, despite damaging U.S. cruisers, underscored the growing imbalance in industrial and logistical capacity. American shipyards repaired damaged cruisers and returned them to service within months, while Japanese destroyer strength eroded steadily under the combined pressures of attrition, fuel shortages, and commitments across multiple theaters. Tassafaronga thus contributed to the gradual shift from a contested campaign in the Southern Solomons to a more general advance of Allied forces toward the Central Pacific. For the individuals who participated, the legacy was measured less in doctrinal debates than in personal experiences and losses. Sailors on both sides remembered sudden explosions in darkness, crowded decks during damage control efforts, and long hours in the water or at fire hoses. Survivors of Northampton and Takanami carried those memories into post-war life, while families of the dead received official notifications that often contained only basic information about the circumstances. In Japan and the United States, memorials and unit histories later incorporated the battle into broader narratives of sacrifice at sea. In historiography, Tassafaronga has generated discussion about command decisions, information processing, and the limits of new technology. Analysts have debated whether alternative U.S. maneuvers or earlier torpedo launches might have reduced cruiser losses, and whether Japanese commanders could have done more to balance the goal of supply delivery with the desire to engage enemy surface forces. The battle is frequently cited in studies of how navies adapt under pressure, as both sides modified tactics and equipment in response to the experience. Iron Bottom Sound, the stretch of water where Northampton and Takanami joined other wrecks from the Solomons campaign, became a physical reminder of the cost of night surface warfare. Post-war surveys and dives located and identified many of these wrecks, adding material evidence to documentary records. The names of ships lost at Tassafaronga appear on memorial lists, alongside those from Savo Island, Cape Esperance, and the naval battle of Guadalcanal, linking the engagement to the larger sequence of operations around Guadalcanal in 1942. In the end, The historical significance of the Battle of Tassafaronga lies in the intersection of its immediate and long-term consequences. Tactically, it showed the continued potency of Japanese destroyer torpedo tactics against radar-equipped opponents. Strategically, it coincided with the point at which Japanese leadership concluded that Guadalcanal could no longer be held. For the United States, it was both a setback in ship losses and a stimulus for changes that would influence later campaigns. As part of the broader Guadalcanal narrative, Tassafaronga illustrates how individual battles at sea can shape and be shaped by wider processes of adaptation, resource allocation, and strategic decision-making on both sides of a conflict.